Okay, so I hope you've had some time to work through this example, so I'm going to go over the answer to each of these parts. So here, our sample would be the 1,000 U.S. college students that were being studied or surveyed, which makes our population all college or all U.S. college students. So that's going to be super important to include in here too. So all U.S. college students would be our population. The statistic that is being measured in the study is either the sample mean, the sample proportion, or the sample standard deviation. We're not looking at the average or anything that rules out the sample mean. We're not looking at the standard deviation, so that rules out the sample standard deviation, which leaves us with the sample proportion. So the sample proportion is the correct answer, but it does require us to do a little bit of work in order to find the value of that statistic. Here we're told that 420 students prefer to study alone, but we should realize from this study that this is out of 1,000 U.S. college students. And so 420 out of 1,000 gives us a proportion, which in this case is 0.42. So if our statistic is the sample proportion, then that means the parameter of interest is the population proportion. We're trying to make a conclusion about the population proportion based on the sample proportion. So finally, the inference that we can make based on what we found is that based on the survey, we can expect 42% of all U.S. college students to prefer studying alone. So I hope you were able to do that without any issues. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or come to my office hours. So now I'm going to go ahead and move on to the last part of section 1. So surveys are not perfect. There are some problems with it. And so I'm going to talk about some of the problems. So one of the biggest issues with surveys is bias. So bias, as defined in the textbook, is the tendency to produce untrue results. So that's just going to be the huge umbrella term that we use. Specifically, we're going to be looking at sampling bias. So sampling bias refers to taking a sample that is not representative of the population. So this is an issue with the samples that you are taking. A source of sampling bias would be response bias. So the tendency for people to respond to surveys only if they feel very strongly about it. So an example of response bias would be, so imagine you have a class and there was an instructor that did really well, really connected with you, and you feel really strongly about this professor and this class. At the end of a semester, how likely are you to write a response or to fill out a course evaluation? In my personal experience, if I had a professor that was like that, I feel like I'm more prone to writing back. So that would be an example of response bias, because I feel so strongly about this professor and their teaching method that I feel like my input or my response is valuable. An example would be, let's say you have a professor that you just did not connect with, you did not like how the class was structured, the teaching style just didn't meet what you needed. At the end of a semester, in my experience, I would also be more likely to respond back and to add comments and suggestions. So again, another example of response bias. So response bias, as we have seen, is the tendency for people to respond when they feel strongly about it. Now the third problem with conducting surveys, or a subtype of bias, would be measurement bias. So measurement bias is looking specifically about the structure of the survey, or the structure or how you're measuring the responses. So measurement bias would be asking questions that do not produce a true answer. And some sources of measurement bias would be reporting your own personal data. So an example of this would be, let's say for the census, let's say that they asked you a question about your income. So most people are more likely to lie about their income when they're reporting it, because either one, low income comes with a negative connotation, and so you lie about your income when you report it. Or number two, maybe you report a lower income than you actually make to receive some benefits. So self-reporting of personal data usually leads to measurement bias. Number two, the use of confusing words in surveys. So using confusing words in surveys can confuse or make it complicated. A lot of people won't understand what you're trying to ask, and so when the survey taker does not understand what you're trying to ask, that might lead to an answer that doesn't even answer the survey question, which can lead to measurement bias. Finally, the use of non-neutral language. So using language that is not neutral or has some bias to it will lead to a biased response. And so that's going to be another source of measurement bias. So moving on to example 2. We're going to go ahead and look at these different scenarios and identify the source of bias. So for letter A, or number 1 in the note packet, sorry, I'm super inconsistent. I created these note packets the first year that I was teaching, and so I just update it here and there, but don't really look at the format. Okay, so the first example, or the first part, a student asked all 2,500 of her Facebook friends to see if they preferred Twitter or to see if they preferred Facebook to Twitter. So I want you to go ahead and think, is there bias? If there is it sampling or measurement bias? If it's sampling bias, is there a source of sampling bias? If it's measurement bias, is there a source of measurement bias? Okay, so for this example right here, I hope you answered that there is sampling bias. So the reason why there is sampling bias is because the student is only surveying her Facebook friends. And so she's not even reaching out to her Twitter friends, and so there's going to be some sampling bias here. In terms of a source of sampling bias, no, there is no source of sampling bias because the only source that we have is response, and in this case it doesn't really apply. Okay. Now the second example right here, a researcher asked 500 randomly selected people, are you in favor of the unfair tax burden that the hardworking, successful business people have so that the lazy unemployed can receive a paycheck without working? So that's a mouthful. So what is one source of bias, or what type of bias is present in this question? So I hope you answered that this is definitely measurement bias. And then the source of measurement bias, I think some people might say confusing words. So it is confusing. It's a very long question. It's a run-on sentence. I don't know about you, but for me, if I was reading this while taking a survey, I would honestly read the first few words and the last few words and totally skip what's in the middle. Some people might also argue that there's non-neutral language. So describing people who are unemployed as lazy is already not neutral. There's already some bias to the question. And so these are two sources of measurement bias. Let's go ahead and look at some more. So C, or number 3 in the note packet. 100 randomly selected Americans were asked by a researcher, do you currently have a sexually transmitted disease? And so for this example, there is measurement bias. I can tell you that right away to save us time. So is there a source of measurement bias? So this kind of question, I feel like, is one that is kind of hard it's hard for people to respond back to a question like this because it's so personal. And so in this case, I would say that self-reporting personal data is the source of measurement bias. So to further emphasize why the source of measurement bias is reporting personal data, having an STD is such a taboo topic, or it carries such a negative connotation, that if people were asked this question, they'll very likely not respond truthfully. And this kind of question, like I said, is sensitive and confidential, and so this is an example of a question that has bias in it and should probably, in my opinion, not be asked. So let's go ahead and look at our last example right here. So our example right here says that Gallup randomly selected 1,000 business phone numbers from the Yellow Pages and called them back to see if they supported government funding of high-speed rail. The hint here is that businesses must pay to have the number in the Yellow Pages. And so, is there a bias? So in this case, there's a bias. The type of bias would be sampling bias. And the reason why it's sampling bias is because the numbers that show up on the Yellow Pages depend on the business. So the business must be able to pay to have their phone numbers in the Yellow Pages. A lot of the smaller companies may not be able to afford that or be able to put their phone numbers out in the Yellow Pages and pay that. And so it's usually larger companies that are able to do that. So there is sampling bias. In terms of the source, I would say there's no source of sampling bias. So hopefully these 4 examples kind of demonstrated how to identify whether there is bias or not, what type of bias between measurement and sampling, and for each types of bias, can you identify a source of the bias? Okay, so we've seen that there are some issues with surveys, such as bias. And so how do we collect a sample that has little bias and can be representative of the population then? So the answer to that is using a simple random sampling, or using an SRS. So a simple random sampling is a random sample that, 1, is equally likely. So everyone has an equal chance of being included in the survey or sample. Number 2 is without replacement. So what this means is that once you've been included in the sample, you can't be included again. Because let's say if I include you 10 times out of my 12 samples, your response is going to skew my data. And so a simple random sampling is a random sample that is equally likely and without replacement. For the rest of this chapter, we will assume that every single sample was based on a simple random sampling. So it should be random, and if it's random, then we can assume that these samples are independent of each other.